Children, I am going to explain you chapter 8, Demosthenes. You must have listened to the summary of the story, so the gist of the lesson is known to you. Let me proceed with the explanation of the lesson. If at first you do not succeed, try again. This is a very common thought, children, and you know that we must keep on trying till we achieve our goal. This piece of advice has helped many people achieve their dreams, however difficult they might have appeared. Demosthenes was born with a severe speech problem, but it did not discourage him. He practiced hard and became one of the greatest orators of his time. So Demosthenes was a person who was born with severe speech problem. He could not speak properly, but in spite of that he practiced very hard and became one of the greatest orators of his time. Orators means a person who make public speeches. People who make speeches in public are very good speakers. They are called orators. So in spite of his problem of speaking, he became a great orator only because he did not give up easily. He kept on trying till he succeeded. As a boy, Demosthenes was shy and delicate. So when Demosthenes was a small boy, he was not bold. He was very shy and very soft. When he made his first public speech, his voice was weak and his words were not clear. He stammered. He could not hear people laugh and jeer at him. He tried to press on, but had to stop his speech and leave. So, when the first time Demosthenes tried to make a speech in front of the public, he was not very confident. His voice was weak and his words were also not clear. He started stammering in front of the people. He could not hear people laugh and jeer at him, and he could not bear that people were laughing and making fun of him because he was not able to speak. He tried to press on. He tried to continue. With great difficulty, he tried to continue to speak, but he had to stop his speech and leave. He tried to continue speaking, but he could not, and he had to leave halfway. Demosthenes could not bear the thought that people found his speech strange and funny. He knew he needed to do something about it, and so began a journey which made him one of the greatest Athenian orators. So he could not bear this thought that people were making fun of him. He was not able to speak in front of the public and people were laughing at him. So he thought that he must do something to overcome his shortcomings. And then he started his journey and he worked so hard that he became one of the greatest Athenian orators. Demosthenes' father, here this is apostrophe S, but because the last letter is S, so S again is not written. Demosthenes' father was a wealthy sword maker in Athens, was a very rich man, and he used to make swords in Athens. He had died when his son was 7 years old. So when Demosthenes was 7 years old, his father died. Although his father left him a fortune means great amount of money. His father left him a good amount of money for him. But what happened? See, Demosthenes' guardians were not careful with his money. Demosthenes was only 7 years old and his guardians were not careful, were not serious about his studies or about his money. They lost some of it and spent some on themselves. They used the money for themselves. In the end, they did not have enough money to give him a good education. So Demosthenes was not able to get a good education because the money which was left by his father for his education was used by his guardian. Demosthenes was angry with his guardians, and this made Demosthenes very angry with his guardians, very annoyed. Was there a way he could make them feel sorry? He wanted to make them feel sorry for the bad work which they had done. He may not have known then and it was learning to speak that would help him. That time he did not know that if he overcomes his speech problem, he would be able to teach them a lesson. Athens then had some great orators. At that time, there were some very great famous orators in Athens. Demosthenes had often heard his teachers talk about them, and he longed to listen to their public speeches. And Demosthenes also had heard his teachers speaking about those great orators, and he also wanted to listen to them. That was not a time of television, children, and so it was very difficult to listen to the great orators. One day, not long after that, he heard that Callistratus, an orator who everyone admired, was to speak at a great trial that was taking place in the city. So Callistratus, who was a great orator at that time, was going to make a speak in the public. Demosthenes heard people talk about Callistratus and begged his tutor to allow him to be in the courtroom when he spoke, and he was going to speak in the courtroom. So he also requested his tutor to allow him to be in the courtroom when he speaks, when Callistratus speaks, so that he could listen to him. The tutor agreed and even arranged a seat from where Demosthenes could see and hear all that went on. The tutor was quite good, so he agreed and he allowed Demosthenes, not only allowed, he arranged for him so that he could see and hear all that went on. He could see and hear Callistratus speaking. The speech was full of power and purpose. This means that the speech was so good that it made a strong effect on the people's mind. People liked the speech very much and they started believing in the speech, whatever he had said. Who had said? Callistratus. When Callistratus had finished, the Athenians crowded round him and many even followed him home. Demosthenes was impressed and inspired. So, Demosthenes was impressed and inspired to see the popularity of Callistratus, that how popular he was among the Athenians. He said to himself, I too will be an orator and make people think about what I am saying. I want to have the power of words to make people agree with me and believe me. In his heart, he also thought, maybe this special talent will also help me fight against the injustice my guardians have done to me. So that day, Demosthenes decided that he also wanted to be that an orator as great as Callistratus, and maybe by this he would be able to fight against the injustice his guardians had done to him. Demosthenes knew that he must work hard to succeed. For the next 2 years, he read history, past tense, wrote speeches and listened to famous orators. So he started working hard to become a good orator. So first thing what he did, in order to become a good orator, he must have good knowledge also. So for the next 2 years, he read history to gather knowledge so that he could speak in public. Wrote speeches. He started writing speeches which he would be speaking in front of the public, and listened to famous orators so that he could copy the way they are speaking. When he was 18, he believed he was ready to speak in public. So when he was 18 years old, he thought that now he was ready to speak in public. He decided to fight against his guardians in a court of law. At first, no one took him seriously, but Demosthenes pleaded his case again and again. So, after that, he decided to fight against his guardians in a court of law. He decided to fight against his guardian so that they return him back the money which they had misused. At first, no one took him seriously, but Demosthenes pleaded his case again and again. Again and again, he went to the court for justice. In the end, he won, and his guardians were ordered by the court to return his money to him. So, in the end, He won the case also, and his guardians were ordered by the court to return him back the money which they had misused, which was left by his father for his education. But it was too late. There was very little money left to recover, but it was too late, and they had used most of the money, and very little money was left which he could recover. Once more, Demosthenes felt great sadness. So still, though after winning, still he could not recover the money. Once more, Demosthenes felt great sadness and anger. So this made him again angry and even sadder. But he would not give up and went on to speak in the assembly of Athens. So he decided not to give up and he went to speak in the assembly of Athens. But his first address was a failure. His address means his first public speech was a failure. Remember this, children, very important. His first public speech was a failure. He could not speak properly. He knew it from the faces of the people around him and was filled with shame. And how could he know? Because from the face, when he looked at the people, from their faces, he came to know that his speech was not very interesting and people were not taking interest in listening him. And so he felt very ashamed of that. This is surely the last time I speak in public, he thought sadly, and he thought that after that, no, I would never be able to speak in public. This must have been the last time. He left the assembly and walked slowly down the road without realizing where he was going. Suddenly, he felt someone touch his arm. So sadly, as he was going down the road, feeling very hopeless, he felt that somebody had touched his arm. It was an old man who had heard him speak in the assembly. He had seen how sad and disappointed Demosthenes was. So an old man who had seen him very disappointed and very sad and heard him speaking in the assembly touched his arm from the back. He looked at him keenly. He looked at him and praised him. He told him that his speech reminded him of the great orator Pericles. Very important. One orator was Callistratus. This is the second orator. So the old man compared his speech with Pericles, who was also a great orator. Okay. So he said that yes, though you were not able to speak very well, but your style was just like Pericles. How can you give up so easily, Demosthenes? He asked. Demosthenes felt encouraged and tried again, but he failed a second time. So second time also he failed. First time also he failed. Second time, after the old man encouraged him, again he went to make a speech in the public. But second time also he failed. This time he left the assembly, hiding his face in his cloak. Cloak is not clock. Cloak is the long cloth which a person wears. An actor named Satyrus, who knew him well, followed him. So this time an actor whose name was Satyrus, very important line, this time he encouraged him. Who knew him well followed him. He knew that Demosthenes would be in despair. The actor was knowing Demosthenes, and he knew that Demosthenes must be very sad and hopeless, so he followed him. Demosthenes did not hide his feelings from Satyrus. A sailor with a foolish story will make them applaud, while if I tell them tales of the glorious deeds of their own countrymen, they do not care, he said bitterly. So Demosthenes did not hide his feelings from Satyrus. He spoke very openly. He said, a sailor with a foolish story, a sailor, when he comes from his voyage, narrates many false stories to people, and people listen to the sailor and applaud. Applaud means they appreciate the sailor for his foolish story. While if I tell them tales of the glorious deeds of their own countrymen, but when I am telling them the glorious deeds of their own countrymen, the great work done by their own countrymen. I am narrating them the real story of their own country. They do not care, he said bitterly. Bitterly means very sadly. He was very, very sad, extremely sad. True, Demosthenes, answered Satyrus, but I'll tell you why it is so if you will recite to me some lines from one of our great poets. Satyrus said, very true. They do not, I agree that they do not listen to you. But I'll tell you why they do not listen to you, why they do not take interest in your speeches if you recite some poems in front of me. Then Demosthenes recited some poems to him. He spoke the words correctly, but his voice was dull. One drawback. The words he was speaking correctly, but his voice was very dull. There was no he did not speak strongly. He was speaking in a very dull and low voice. There was awkwardness in the way he delivered the speech. He was not delivering the speech. He delivered the speech very poorly. Okay, when Demosthenes finished, Satyrus repeated the lines back to him. Demosthenes stood still with surprise. He could not believe that they were the same lines. The actor's eyes flashed, his voice rose and fell, and his body swayed as he spoke. So when Demosthenes was speaking, his voice was very dull. He spoke in a very poor manner. But when Demosthenes finished, Satyrus repeated the same lines. And when Demosthenes saw him speaking, he was extremely surprised. He was astonished to see the same lines. He could not believe that they were the same lines, because the same lines were spoken by Satyrus in a very, very different manner. When Satyrus was speaking, his eyes flashed. His eyes were also speaking. The feeling was not only in words. He was not only reading the words, his whole body was speaking. His voice rose and fell. Voice modulation was there. It was not a flat reading. Okay, his eyes were also speaking, and his body swayed as he spoke, and his body language was totally different. So this made Demosthenes feel very astonished. Demosthenes understood why his speeches did not interest the Athenians. Now he realized why people did not like his speech, because his reading was very flat. He realized that he must not only read or recite them, but also act them. Okay? And that is why you like to listen to the film stars, because they only do not read the dialogues, they act the dialogues. So when your reading is meaningful, actful, then only people will like to listen to you. From that day on, Demosthenes began to work in a different way. From that day on, Demosthenes began to work in a different way. So that day Demosthenes realized his drawback, his shortcomings, and he came to know to which direction he had to work in order to become a good orator, in order to become a great orator. He converted one of the cellars of his house into a study. So first of all, he converted one of the cellars. Cellars means underground rooms used for storing things. He converted one of the cellars of his house into his study room. Then he practiced undisturbed, so that he could practice undisturbed over there. He often lived in his study for 2 or 3 months at a stretch. He used to live for 2 or 3 months at a stretch in continuity in his study room, practicing very hard to overcome his speech problem. They say, that means people say, he went to the seashore and shouted his speeches with pebbles in his mouth. It made him struggle to bring out every sound. So he used to go to the seashore and put pebbles in his mouth and used to speak his speeches. Why? So that when he spoke without the stones, the words came through loud and clear. So that when he is speaking without the stones, he is clearer and louder. He washed himself in the mirror as he spoke to improve his expressions, gestures, and actions. While speaking, this is the second thing he used to do. The first thing, he converted the cellar of his house into his study room. Secondly, he used to speak at the seashore with pebbles in his mouth. And thirdly, he used to watch himself in the mirror while speaking so that he could improve his expressions, gestures, and action, so that he could see his facial expressions, he could see his body movement, his body language, and so to make out whether his speeches are meaningful or not, so that he could overcome his shortcomings. He practiced speaking as he walked or ran along the seashore. So while running or walking along the seashore also, he practiced speaking. He raised his voice so that he could be heard above the roaring waves. He raised his voice. That time there were no mics, children. So he shouted in front of the roaring waves so that he could, and shouted so loudly that he could be heard over the roaring waves. He also practiced speaking as he ran up a hill. He also practiced speaking while running up a hill. All these trained his breath, voice, and tone. These all practices trained his breath. He got control over his breath. His voice he was able to raise the volume of his voice, and the tone of the voice also improved. Demosthenes' speeches were now filled with drama and purpose. That means his speeches were no longer simple reading. They were very meaningful now. He was no longer the boy who was shy and spoke with a stammer. So he overcame all his problems due to his very, very hard practice. And he was no longer a boy who was very shy and who hesitated to speak in public or who stammered while speaking.